Hey there, this is Ray Villalobos, and today I'm going to show you how to build a UI slider with JavaScript and jQuery UI. So this is based on an article that I wrote on my website called iviewsource.com. You can find the URL right here. On this page, you can also find downloads for the CSS, HTML, JavaScript, as well as a copy of the interface I built in Fireworks. So I've seen a lot of these type of volume and UI sliders in places like Forest and Dribble, but I really didn't see a lot of them built out or a demo on how to do some of those. So I'm going to show you how to do that. And this should build something like this that lets you control the volume of a song using HTML5. This technique is using the jQuery UI library, specifically the slider component of jQuery UI, which you could find in this URL. It's super easy to use, and there's a lot of different options on how they work. So if you want to read up on that, that's cool. But I'll show you how to do them step by step. So here's what I'm starting with. I have just a basic HTML page, and inside I have a link to the CSS file. Right now that's empty. And down here I have links to the CDNs for jQuery, jQuery UI, as well as a link to my JavaScript file. Right now that just has a document ready function ready for me to put in some scripts in there. So we've got just a div with an ID of player to hold the player itself, and then a div with an ID of volume to hold most of the slider interface. So really, to build a slider with jQuery UI, all you have to do is type in the $selector and then give it an ID. Like I can target my ID of volume and then use the slider method or the function from jQuery UI. So when I save that, you won't really see anything happening, but if I were to pull this up in my inspector, you would actually be able to see that the classes have been added right there, as well as another handle added right on top of it. So although we can't see it, it's there. And if I were to plug in like one of the default jQuery themes, so you could do that by plugging in this URL, then you'll be able to see the little slider working. So it's actually pretty easy to code. The trick is going to be making it look like how we want it to look. So I'm going to take off this line of code here with one of the default jQuery themes, and I'm going to build my own. So I'll start off with the CSS. I'll do the style for the body. And in there, I'm just going to give the body a height of 300 pixels. This is so my background pattern will show up. And then I'll give it a default background color. And that's going to be a pretty dark gray. And then after that, I'm going to do a background that has kind of a gradient and a pattern right behind it. So I'm going to do just one, and I'll just do the default one, which is I'll do a radial gradient. And it's going to start off with a color that's a little bit lighter, 100, 100, 100, and 0.5. And then I'm going to go to another color, another RGBA color. This one's going to be like the color of my background, 17, 17, 17, and 0. This will be placed at the 40% position. When you're doing a radial gradient, you're doing two circles, one at a certain position, and that's going to be right now in the center, and one at the 40% position off from that center. I definitely don't want to repeat, so I'll do no repeat. And then I'll put in a URL for the background. And finally, a backup color. Need a comma right here. And now the gradient's showing up within that 300 pixel size. So I could sit here and just type in all the other ones, but hopefully you understood this. So I'm just going to go to the website with the article and just copy the rest of the code for the background. So I'll just copy the whole body code here. And just paste that in, and it'll show up just fine. But this is just so that it shows up in different browsers. So okay, the CSS for the player now is going to show the background of the music players that have to. So the CSS for the player now that I need to build is going to show the background for the music player, and that has the speakers and the volume text. So just these little speakers plus this volume is a graphic that I included in my graphics files, and I need to show that. So the player itself, it's going to have a width of 350 pixels, a height of 50. And this is important. I need to set the position of this to relative. That's because I want the rest of the elements within the player to follow or move along with the player. So by setting this thing by setting the position of the player to relative and everything inside to absolute, those elements will move with the player. I want to center this, so I'll set the margin to 0 auto. And I'll move this from the top of the page by 150 pixels. And then I will set a background image. And that's just going to be the copy of my image with the little volumes and the text. And I definitely don't want that to repeat. And be aligned to the left top. That's that for our little player. You can see the graphics appearing right here already. So I have another item that I need to add to the volume ID. And this is going to be the layer that shows up when there's no volume at a certain level. So it's going to be essentially the empty volume layer. So this position will be absolute so that it moves with the previous element, right? And I'll just position it from the left side, 24 pixels. I want to center it again, so margin 0 auto. Height is going to be 15 pixels. And the width is going to be 300 pixels. And then I'll just add a background just like I did with the other one. No repeat, left top. And if I save that, you can see the little empty volume right on top of this. So the next thing that I need to make is the volume overlay. This is what's going to show up when the user moves the knob from left to right. Like the volume, the position is going to be absolute. So now we're getting into the code that jQuery UI is generating. So we need to call this thing called UI slider, range, min. And if you were to inspect the element, you would note that that is part of the things that jQuery UI is creating. So you could see these things appearing right here. We can target those CSS elements and place whatever we want as the graphics for the background. So that's what I'm doing right now. So UI slider range min, we'll set the height to 15 pixels, the width to 300 pixels. Again, position absolute so that it moves with the player no matter where the player is placed. This volume will move along with it. And then another background URL. Again, no repeat, left top. So save that, refresh. You're not going to really see anything because I don't have my knob in there and I can't kind of slide, but this would be what shows up as blue when I move that slider over. Okay, so now I need to do my knob. So to do that, I'll target volume again, and then the class called UI slider handle, right? And that can be whatever graphic you want it to be right here. So a width and a height, I know how big my graphics are. So 38 pixels by 39 pixels. And that's just because it has a little bit of a drop shadow. So a background again of URL, images, volume, -knob, a PNG. And if you download all these graphics, you can kind of see the breakdown of the different elements. Once again, position is going to be absolute so that it moves with the player. And I just have to move it over by adding some margin. And I'll do -15 pixels and margin top, -8 pixels. And I'm going to save this. And now you can see the knob and you can click and drag it. You can't really see the volume happening because we haven't built the function that deals with what happens with the volume. And now I need to go into my slider.js. The slider by itself doesn't really do anything. So we need to pass it along an object. So we can set up a minimum value. Then we can set up a maximum value. So what's going to be the value when it goes all the way to the right? And then you can also set a value. And the value will be your starter position for this. If I set the value of 50, it's going to be at the middle. And since my maximum is 100, if I set it to 100, then it'll be all the way to the right. I personally don't want the volume of any song to be playing when I first go into a page. So I'll start off by setting the value of 0. So I'm going to also add an attribute called animate. And if I do that, you'll notice that when I click on an area in my slider, the slider kind of moves towards that position. That looks a lot better. So I like that. The other thing that I need to do is, by default, jQuery UI will not place a separate layer to show the range of the elements. So I can't see my little blue area as I move this along. So I need to add another parameter here called range and set it to what I want it to show when I move the minimum range over. So I'll set this to minimum. When I add the min parameter, what it does is creates another layer, and I can target the style of that layer, which I've already done with my CSS. Remember, there's this thing here that I targeted called UI slider range min. That's the layer that has my blue element right here. And that's why I had to code it that way. By outlining this as range min, when I inspect element, you'll see that there is an additional element here called UI slider range min. And I can target that with CSS. So now that I have the slider looking pretty good, let's make it do something. And to do that, I'll use the slide variable. I'll pass it along a function. This will be a function literal, which just means a function without a name. And in here, I want to pass it along two things: the event that takes place when somebody slides my knob, as well as the UI, which has information about the slide, you know, how far I went, what position I went into, and that kind of stuff. So if I create an item right here, then I can call a function. I don't have this function yet, but I'm going to call a function called setVolume, and I'll pass it along the UI value. So this UI element is going to have the value of where I have let my knob go within the range that I created up here. This function is going to take the value of the range divided by 100. Why? Because HTML5 volume expects a number between 0 and 1, and I set my range between 0 and 100. So I need to divide that by 100 to get a number between 0 and 1. So this is a function we're going to create in just a minute. So now we need to set up an audio object. We can do that by using the createElement function in JavaScript, and we're going to do that right here. Create a variable, call it myMedia, and set it to create an element. And the type of element that we want to create is an audio object. Just creating an element in the DOM is not going to actually place the element in the DOM. So this is just creating an element and preparing it. So now we need to append it or place it on the page. Where do I want to place it? Of course, I probably want to place it in my player ID. So I'll target the player ID with jQuery and then set append to my media. So that creates an audio object and it appends it to an element with an ID of player. We're going to be targeting this element later, so it's best to give it an ID. So I'll do my media ID equals, and I'll just call it the same thing, my media, just to make it easier. So now if we go take a look at this page, then open up this body tag, you'll see that the player, inside the player, you'll see this audio that has an ID of my media. So we've just created an audio object and given it an ID so that we can target it. So next, I need to actually start playing my audio. I'm going to do that by calling a function that, again, I'll create in just a minute. It's going to be called playAudio, and that's going to take two things. First, the location of the audio file, which I've placed all the audio files in this audio folder, right? And then the name of the file. So I've called this song view source, and I'm going to give it also a volume, pass it along a volume. Now, this is not the full name of the file. The reason for that is some older versions of Firefox do not understand the MP3 format. So I'm going to have to create a call for Firefox and a different call for other browsers. So I need to give the file names different extensions. We'll deal with that when we create the playAudio function. So now we're done with this section, and we'll need to create the function that plays the audio. So function playAudio, and we're going to pass it along a file name as well as a volume. So I'll call this my volume, and we'll create the function right here. Now, what we want to do next is test to see whether or not the browser supports the MP3 format. And if it does, then I want to create a variable here called media extension. It's going to assign the MP3 extension to this variable if the browser can play that media. So if the object that I have called my media can play type, this is a JavaScript function, and then say audio, this is a MIME type, so MP3. So this browser can play the audio MP3 format then, and this is called a ternary operator. It's just a quicker way of writing an if statement. So if the file can play MP3s, then media extension is going to get a value of .mp3. Otherwise, and then I'll do another sort of if statement here, and I'll just copy this whole thing. If it can play audio/OGG files, which is what Firefox plays, then, and maybe this will be easier if I move this up here and then maybe move that up there, then it's going to get the value .ogg. So the variable media extension will get the value OGG. Otherwise, it's going to get nothing. So now we can kind of build a name out of the file name and the media extension that we received. So we'll say mymedia.src. So the location of the media file will be file name plus whatever the media extension is that we just created above. And if you want to, you can also set the song to loop. In this particular example, since I don't know when I'm going to be dragging that slider, I just set it to an infinite loop. So you could set any attribute by saying my media.set attribute loop, and we'll just set that to also loop, and that'll just loop the file forever. Finally, we need to set the volume of this media file. So I'll call the set volume function that I'm going to create in just a minute, and I'll pass it along my volume. And then .play, and that will play the audio. Now, it's not going to do it yet because I haven't created this other function called set volume, which is what I need to do next. It's going to be a pretty easy function. We'll do function set volume and set that to my volume. It's going to receive a variable that will call my volume. And in here, we'll create a variable for my media, and it's going to get the element called my media in the DOM. You could probably do this with jQuery if you wanted to. So my media, and then set the volume of that element to whatever gets passed in here, my volume. So you're probably wondering, why did I make that like a separate function? Why didn't I just put it here? Whenever the slider slides, all I really need to do is not load a new audio file. I just need to play it at a different volume. So I want to keep on calling this function. Looks like I forgot something. This needs to be document.getElementById, my media, and then I'll save it and refresh, and now this is working just fine. Now, if you don't want this little annoying border, then we can go into CSS and just make sure that we say border none, and then also outline none on all these. So the volume slider and the volume slider and little handle. So save that, and now you won't see that annoying border. Having jQuery UI makes it incredibly simple to create the slider. By understanding the way that the slider creates the layers for you, you can then take one of those really awesome UI examples and make it look however you want it to look.